All right, how to upgrade while you still own property. This is a question that we're getting a lot at the moment, so I thought I'd just shoot a video to explain some of the options that you've got. If you're wanting to discuss this with one of our advisors, all you need to do is head to our website and click the book chat button. So it's a really big hurdle and the property market is super, super tight. If someone's wanting to upgrade their property, then we're having to basically talk them through these options. One of the most important things to remember in a tight market like this is that the first offer that you put down has to be really good. You have to basically be putting your best offer in straight away because properties are just going very quickly. So let's talk through the 4 options that we've got. Option number 1 is upgrading and keeping your property. So this is usually the first option that we'll look at. Keeping your existing property and purchasing new means that we get the benefit of growth from both properties. The biggest concerns here are, or the biggest things that we need to determine are, number 1, do you have the available equity to purchase? So the equity in your property, let's say you've got a loan of $500,000 and a property worth $1 million. That difference, $500,000, is not the amount that we have available to us because we just don't. Then we can't use $500,000 to purchase the next property. We can only typically borrow up to 80, 90, sometimes 95% if you're medical on the existing property. So in that scenario, with a $1 million value, $500,000 existing loan, we'd have $450,000 potentially available to take out. And then that is like our deposit to put towards a new property. We may not need to use the 450, we may structure it slightly differently, but you've got to remember that the equity is not the total equity in your property because we do need to keep some sort of margin there just in case you can't make the repayments on your loan. So that's the first thing. Do we have the available equity to purchase? And then the second thing we look at is, can you afford the repayments? So quite often we see clients coming to us with the intention of keeping properties, but then once we go through the numbers, they'll actually balk at the cost. Now, given that the property is an existing property, quite often we can't use the plant and equipment depreciation that makes a tax deduction worth it. Usually, if you've got an existing property, you usually haven't purchased that with investing in mind. And so that means it's potentially, even though it could be an investment property, it may be not the best investment decision to actually keep it. One of the things that makes investment properties so attractive is the depreciation that we're able to use to reduce our taxable income. A lot of that depreciation comes from the plant and equipment, and that only typically can be applied if the property is relatively new, because just of the way tax depreciation works, which is not a topic for this video. So to keep in mind, sometimes the existing property, as I've literally just said, is not the best investment property. It wasn't purchased for that. On the flip side, we've already secured this property. So if we can keep it and we know the property market is doing pretty well, ideally then we've got a larger asset base in order for a larger asset base is going to do better over time. And so given that we've already secured the property, ideally we'd like to keep that property because selling it and buying a more suitable investment property is going to incur a lot of costs that we then count against the potential gains from having a better investment property in the first place, if that makes sense. So there's like a sunk cost there. To access that amount of leverage growth would mean buying and selling and incurring all those fees again. That's the first thing that we look at. We look at the depreciation. We've got calculators to check the tax deductions, and we can check the scenario there to see whether that's actually feasible for you and your family. That's option number 1. Option 2 is buying before selling. So this is probably the least desirable option because if it's mistimed, it could mean that you're going to end up homeless. Obviously not a good position to be in. The benefit of doing it this way, if we're selling before buying, is that you can start placing offers without the encumbrances of having to add a subject to sale to the contract of the property you're looking to buy. As you can imagine, that's not a particularly appealing offer to a seller. And this is something that we typically will have to put in option 3, which is buying before selling. Imagine if you're selling a property and there's 2 basically identical offers that have come in, but one is subject to sale. That means that you're relying on a whole set of circumstances that you don't want to have to bother about. So you're 100% never going to choose that option. The ideal scenario here is that you actually place your property onto the market while simultaneously starting to search for a new place. So roughly the steps are as follows. That you have an offer accepted on your property with a short finance clause and ideally a long settlement clause, because that's going to give you time to find a place. Number 2, you're actually simultaneously looking for a place to buy. So you put your property up on the market. At the same time, you're looking for a place to buy. You find a property you like at the same time as someone else is placing an offer on yours. You place an offer subject to finance. Your finance is dependent on your property going unconditional. Your settlement date is ideally on the same day of this as the settlement of your property. This basically makes it like a simultaneous settlement, a simultaneous transaction. That way you're basically on the same day, you're selling a property, you're buying a property, you're settling on both. You can move out of one place and into the next at the same time. The next best scenario here is to settle 3 or 4 days after the settlement of yours. So sorry, to clarify that, the settlement of your new place occurs 3 to 4 days after the settlement of your existing place. This is safer because there are fewer banks involved. Like you can imagine on a simultaneous settlement, you've got multiple banks, you've got condition reports, you've got multiple conveyancers, you've got multiple people involved in the transaction, and that just adds to the margin for error. If one of those things goes wrong, if the condition report's not right, if the conveyancer's not ready, if a document hasn't been signed on a property that you're not even involved with, then it just can get really complex, and it's easy for those settlements to fall over, which just mucks everything up. The downside here is that you're left homeless for a few days. So this can be solved with a sort of a week-long lease back on your property. So effectively, you lease the property you've just sold. That then gives you like maybe a week or 2 weeks to actually move into the new place. That all, of course, depends on the buyers of the property that you've just sold not needing to move into your property. And that agreement would need to be put in place when the property is actually sold. So it's not very common. Things to keep in mind. I've seen chains of property reactions. So if you can imagine someone buying, someone selling, and that person selling then requiring funds to come from another property that they're currently selling. I've seen 3 or 4 of these transactions requiring to settle at the same time. It is a nightmare. It's not pretty. It's very, all the things that can go wrong are just compounded. It's not pretty and it's best avoided if possible. If you have somewhere to live after your property is sold before you buy, this actually probably works out pretty well, as long as you can stand living for a few months with typically the in-laws. Okay, option 3 is buying before selling. This is very similar to option 2, but with the important distinction that you should probably declare in the contract that the contract, if you're buying a property, is subject to sale of your property as well as finance. Now, you could get away with only a subject to finance clause because your finance is not going to be approved if you can't afford to keep both properties anyway. But given that finance clauses are typically only 14 to 28 days long, it really doesn't give you enough time to have someone put an offer in on your property and go unconditional on it, and for that to actually be submitted to a bank and then approved by the lender, even if we've got some sort of pre-approval in place. So it's really best that you do declare that the offer that you're putting in is subject to the sale of your property. Again, though, not super appealing for seller. Importantly, really important to note, getting to a finance date with no approval or decline letter is going to cause problems and could place you in a fair amount of legal strife. So best avoided. And ideally, you should try to do everything simultaneously. But if you happen to find a place before you have offers in on yours, you should declare that the contract is subject to sale, even though that means it's going to be vastly less attractive to the seller and probably unlikely to go through unless they've got no other offers. If there are no other offers on the property, typically what the seller will do is place a 48-hour clause where they will say, yep, your offer is accepted, subject to us giving 48 hours notice. So what that allows them to do is to continue marketing the property, attracting offers, hopefully with some better sale conditions. And then if they find one, because you're only allowed to have one active contract on a property at any one time, a 48-hour clause, once they activate it, gives you 48 hours to go unconditional on the purchase, which means that if you haven't found a buyer for your property, then basically you can't meet that, and so the property then goes back on the market. They can they can then accept the new offer that's been placed on the property. All right, so to keep in mind, 2 offers that are identical, I've already said this, but 2 offers that are identical except for a subject to sale clause will always mean that the other gets accepted. Option 4, and this is one that we're doing quite a lot of, we're talking to a lot of clients about at the moment, is bridging finance. So if keeping both properties is not financially viable, then bridging finance is going to be our next best option. So bridging finance allows us to buy and sell on a property before we, buy and settle on a new property before we actually sell our existing property. So this does away with the pressure to settle simultaneously. It removes the requirement for a subject to sale clause, and it means that you don't need to live with your in-laws, which some might say is the biggest bonus of all. In this scenario, we're going to approach the lender seeking to secure finance based on the amount of debt that we'll end up with after we sell our existing property. So we're applying specifically for a bridging loan. It's a specific type of finance product. The bank is going to allow us to hold both properties for a period of time, usually for around 6 months. Obviously, the new property we purchased, we're going to hold for a long time, but it's going to give us a period of grace, typically around 6 months, with the understanding that we're going to be working as hard as we can to sell our existing property in that 6-month time period. So this option takes the pressure off everyone. It's a pretty good option. It's not available to everyone, which I'll explain in a minute, but it's an option that we're utilizing more and more as clients are trying to upgrade and needing to present really strong offers as soon as the properties are listed. So it's like what I said at the top. Subject to sale is not particularly enticing. You need to put your best possible offer in as soon as you possibly can, as soon as that property is listed. There's not really much back and forth on negotiation at the moment. And that means that we need to have typically all this stuff sorted before you start placing offers, but you need to make sure that offer is the best it can possibly be. So to keep in mind, banks will vary a lot in their bridging finance policies. Some don't even offer it, so you need to know who to talk to and what you're asking for. Talk to a broker for this one for sure. You need to have a comfortable amount of equity. So this is probably the one that trips people up the most. You need to have a comfortable amount of equity in the existing property for this to be possible. So typically a lender will allow a maximum loan to value ratio of 80% on the peak debt. So that's the peak debt is your existing debt plus all the debt that you're taking on for the new property as well. And finally, you don't just get a free pass on the total debt owed. So during the time that you own both properties, you've got your existing debt on the current property. You've also taken on a lot of debt for the new property. You're holding a fair amount of debt. The bank is going to require you to service the end debt. So they're going to base your loan calculations, your repayments and your borrowing calculations on the end debt. But there's going to be a period of time, maybe 1 month, maybe 6 months, probably not 6 in this market, but there's going to be a period of time where we've got a large amount of debt. That debt still accumulates interest. So the debt that you hold while you still have the two properties still needs to be paid out monthly, or it accrues and it's included in the settlement cost when your existing home sells. So different banks will do that different ways, but you do need to pay the interest costs on the entire debt while you've got both. Okay, so this can get pretty complex. We'd love to talk you through your situation to see if we can help. All you need to do is head to our website and click the book chat button, select lending instead of planning and just any available lender. Or if you've got one of your favorites, then choose your favorite lender. We'd love to help you.